Thank you very much for coming. This is the annual James McCune Smith Lecture, which has been taking place at the University of Glasgow for the last 3 to 4 years. My name is Rosie Spooner. I'm a lecturer in Museum Studies here at the University of Glasgow. And it's my really great pleasure to introduce Professor Charmaine Nelson from McGill University in Montreal to give this year's annual James McCune Smith Lecture. Before introducing Professor Nelson, I'd like to say a few words about the nature of the speaker series. Born in 1813 in New York City, Dr. James McCune Smith was the first African American to be awarded a doctoral medical degree. He completed all of his higher education here at the University of Glasgow, receiving a bachelor's degree in 1835, a master's degree in 1836, and then a doctorate in 1837. While in Glasgow, McCune Smith was an active member of the Glasgow Emancipation Society, which was formed in 1835, and lobbied in favor of the abolition of slavery with the British Empire, and particularly in the United States. After returning to the northern US in the early 1840s, McCune Smith practiced as a pharmacist. He was the first African American to own and run a pharmacy in the United States, and is now recognized as a notable physician, apothecary, abolitionist, author, writer. Underlying these significant accomplishments is the fact that Dr. McCune Smith was the son of an enslaved black woman and a white merchant businessman, and was born into slavery. Just the other week, it was announced that a new £90 million learning and teaching facility at the University of Glasgow would be named after Dr. McCune Smith, an act that follows recommendations set out in the recently published report, Slavery, Abolition, and the University of Glasgow, co-authored by Dr. Stephen Mullen and Professor Simon Newman, both from the university. So it's in this context that I have the honor of introducing Professor Charmaine Nelson, this year's McCune Smith speaker. Professor Nelson has played a leading role in really opening up the field of Black Canadian studies, producing a number of groundbreaking pieces of scholarship. Her research and teaching span post-colonial and Black feminist scholarship, transatlantic slavery studies, and Black diaspora studies. Working across disciplines, her scholarship examines Canadian, American, European, and Caribbean art and visual culture, as well as the links between them. Professor Nelson has published 7 books. These include the co-edited volumes Racism A, which I can say is a Canadian, a critical interdisciplinary anthology of race and racism in Canada, and also Towards an African-Canadian Art History, Art, Memory, and Resistance, published in 2004 and 2018, respectively. And the monographs, The Color of Stone, Sculpting the Black Female Subject in 19th Century America, which published in 2007, Representing the Black Female Subject in Western Art, 2010, and Slavery, Geography, and Empire in 19th Century Marine Landscapes of Montreal and Jamaica, published in 2016. The latter of which delivers one of the first slavery studies books to juxtapose temperate and tropical slavery, and the first such comparative work within the discipline of art history. Nelson's current research project, funded by a grant from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or SSHRC, which is the Canadian equivalent of the AHRC, stays with Canada and Jamaica and explores fugitive slave advertisements as visual culture. It considers how these ephemeral materials can disclose details about the process of creolization in temperate and tropical sites of empire. It is this current research that Professor Nelson will speak to this evening. So, without further ado, it is my great pleasure to welcome Professor Charmaine Nelson.
Thank you all very much for coming. It's an honor and a privilege to be here, and my immense gratitude to Dr. Rosemary Spooner, Dr. Faye Hamill, and Dr. Christine White for having me here, and they've been in conversation with me, I think, for I don't know how many months now, 6 maybe or more. So thank you so much for bringing me here. And also to Zandra Yeeman, thank you for adding me to the Black History Month events that you're convening for Glasgow for this year. It's a privilege, thank you. All right, so just a disclaimer here. So this is a work in progress, so I do welcome your feedback and your questions and your comments. Where I'm headed with this, I've published already a journal article in a book chapter, but eventually it will become a single authored book, okay? So again, I welcome your questions and your comments. And I'm trying not to be too jargony. As an art historian, there might be terms I use during the lecture that are unclear. So at the end, hopefully, if anything was unclear, please ask me and I'll clear that up for you, okay? So I'll jump in here. So I start with two quotes. The first from Thomas Cooper, who was an observer of Jamaican slavery, a British observer, and I'll just read this out for you here. The sound of the whip is so common in the field that one gets to hear it as a matter of course, and that without any particular observation or feeling. Hence, many persons, after a residence of a few years in the colonies, fall into the idea that the slaves are, on the whole, mildly treated, and that there is really no necessity for making any material alteration to their circumstances, end quote. The second is from a contemporary historian of Jamaican slavery, Trevor Bernard. Quote, Jamaican slaves lived in a world of radical uncertainty, always vulnerable to the depredations of whites and fellow slaves, unprotected by law, subject to a harsh work discipline, and forced to submit to the wills of often unpredictable masters or else suffer horrific punishments. Slaves were cast adrift in a hostile and uncertain sea, end quote. As the 19th century observer of slavery, Thomas Cooper, explained, corporal punishment was such a common aspect of Jamaican slavery that it seemed perfectly normal to the island's ruling white minority. However, as Trevor Bernard suggests, the ubiquity of corporal punishment led to dire consequences for the enslaved majority population, both physical and psychological. Transatlantic slavery was premised upon the strategic dehumanization and animalization of enslaved Africans as a way to, quote unquote, break or season a population that was deemed by Western pseudosciences and popular thought alike to be uniquely fit for servitude due to their supposed brutishness and insentience. In the early modern world, slavery and the conceptualization of Africans as subhuman allowed Europeans to export forms of corporal punishment to their colonies, which were deemed to be too cruel and too inhumane for the punishment of whites. The physical dehumanization of the enslaved went hand in hand with strategic material deprivation, cultural prohibitions, and social humiliation. A part of this process necessarily involved the regularized use of corporal punishment. While much is known about the commonality of abuse and torture within Caribbean and Southern American plantation regimes, a significant body of scholarship on the white use of violence to control, punish, and torment the enslaved in the northern territories that became Canada has yet to be produced. So when we're talking about slavery in Canada, slavery transpired everywhere from Ontario eastward. So Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, Prince Edward Islands, Newfoundland, and Cape Breton. Okay, and that's just because of the way the country was colonized. My research seeks to redress this scholarly void by examining the use of corporal punishment in the 18th century and the 19th century within the practices of British Canadian slavery, primarily in the cities or settlements of Halifax, Montreal, and Quebec City, so Nova Scotia and Quebec, and distinguishing it from Jamaica, a tropical British plantation regime. Using the ubiquity and refinement of violence in the slave-holding territory of British Jamaica as a point of contrast, I will examine the underexplored archive of Canadian fugitive slave advertisements to provide evidence of the various types of cruel and unusual punishment which were employed by white slave owners in Nova Scotia and Quebec. So that is 2 different provinces. Fugitive or runaway slave ads, so 2 different names for the same thing, are full of resistive promise. The promise was at least twofold. Firstly, that such advertisements existed across the Americas, and in Europe too, is a testament to the consistent resistance of Africans to slavery. So basically, anywhere you had a printing press and slavery, you had enslaved people running away, you'll find fugitive slave ads, okay? But the function of the ads to recuperate property also resulted in an uncommonly honest archive being produced. Secondly, in comparison to slave sale ads, so this is an example of a slave sale ad from Nova Scotia, through which the slave as a product was presented almost always without defect, physical or moral. Fugitive ads functioned through the description of corporeal detail, which consistently pointed out the lie of the supposed homogeneity, inhumanity, inferiority, dependency, and lack of civility of the enslaved population. Indeed, the desire to recuperate their lost property was so great that white slave owners took great pains to detail all manner of characteristics, attributes, traits, mannerisms, and skills of their missing property, details which arguably individualized and humanized the enslaved. The process of slave escape, often deliberately revealed in such ads, also inadvertently exposed the forethought, intellect, and sophisticated reasoning of the enslaved that involved the intimate knowledge of their owners' lifestyles, the customs of the colony, and regional knowledge of the governing racial, class, religious, and political orders. For instance, when Chloe described as a Negro wench, and I'm sorry, but I'm going to use the horrible language you find in the ads, I think it's important that we remind ourselves that this language was commonplace historically. So for instance, when Chloe described as a Negro wench fled from the Jewish merchant Joseph of Berthier, Quebec, Joseph's ad disclosed that, quote, she got out of the garret window by the help of a ladder and subsequently departed in a canoe with an unidentified man. So Chloe had a plan, right? She had to put the ladder at the window at a certain time when no one would see the ladder so that she could get out the window and go off with this man in the canoe, okay? In another example, when the 26-year-old enslaved black female named Cash escaped from the Quebec City-based tailor Hugh Ritchie in 1779, she did so with, quote, a large bundle of wearing apparel belonging to herself, consisting of a black satin cloak, caps, bonnets, ruffles, ribbons, 6 or 7 petticoats, a pair of old stays, and many other articles of value which cannot be ascertained. It is likely she may change her dress. Clearly, the process of attempting to recapture an enslaved person through the textual order of print culture required that slave owners disclose details about the runaway, which were unhelpful to the idea of slaves as controlled, idle, unintelligent property. Printers fundamentally reinforced slavery and its racial hierarchy by facilitating the rights of slave owners to reduce certain humans to property. The arrogance of the slave-owning class can often be deduced in the tone of the notices, which, when the enslaved made a habit of escape, became more aggressive. For instance, while upon her first documented escape on the 18th of August, 1778, the enslaved female Belle was described by her owner, George Hipps, as a mulatto negress. When she again fled in October, on the 29th of the same year, he referred to her instead as a mulatto wench, a word commonly used to describe a female of low morality. The fact that Hipps' second notice combined the description of Belle as both a wench and a girl is indicative of the imposition of an abject sexuality upon black females at a very young age by white colonialists. Fugitive slave ads circulated widely due to the cheapness and reproducible nature of the print medium. The circulation was also calculated to match the distances across which fleeing slaves traveled, and slavers sometimes blanketed a region with simultaneous ads in multiple papers or placed notices in newspapers in other regions where they assumed the fugitive to be heading. When the 16-year-old white bond servant or indentured servant named Francis Freeland and a 28-year-old Negro man named Ireland escaped from the Irish-born New York merchant William Gilliland, Gilliland placed a fugitive notice in the Quebec Gazette. So remember, he's in New York State. He puts an ad in the Quebec Gazette, urging the public to apply to Moses Hazen, Esquire, in St. John, Mr. John McCord, merchant in Quebec City, and Mr. Thomas McCord, merchant in Montreal, for $6. So the public could go to any of those three people or directly to Gilliland in New York State. The slave-owning class sought to criminalize demonstrations of agency by the self-motivated people to code running away as what Marcus Wood, a British scholar, has termed an act of theft, albeit a paradoxical self-theft. So think about it. What a fugitive was guilty of was stealing themselves from their owner, because they, as an enslaved person, were considered property. Against this colonial act of dehumanization, I would like to position the fugitives not as criminals, but as freedom seekers, and the act of running away as a defiant and extremely perilous act of self-redefinition. Fugitive slave ads were also a primary source with prescribed limits. The limit of the slave ad is that it confirms only that someone socially deemed to be a slave ran away from a person who claimed to own that runaway. Such ads also confirm that the runaway was valuable enough to be pursued. And these are some of the categories that you'll find again and again in fugitive slave ads across the different regions. The ads provide a window into the lives and worlds of the enslaved because each example was about the recapture of an individual or individuals who had fled, and as such required that the owners share details that illuminated what made the runaways unique, both in manner and appearance. As such, these ads, ubiquitous across the Americas, are repositories of data on enslaved populations, recording all manner of visual characteristics, skills, and oral attributes of the runaways. Amongst the visual characteristics most commonly cited were the conditions of the bodies of the enslaved. While such details included scarification and hairstyles created by the enslaved person or their communities, they also describe bruising, lacerations, branding, scars, and other marks of owner-imposed violence, torture, and corporal punishment. So this here is an example from Jamaica, where you'll find a lot of ads that actually will say that the person was branded. While as described above, the corporal punishment and torture of the enslaved was ubiquitous and came to be seen as normal in Jamaica, did the proximity of the enslaved to their owners in the urban spaces of Halifax, Montreal, and Quebec City, and the heavy burdens of continual surveillance changed the way that white slave owners used material deprivation, physical violence, and psychological manipulation to control the enslaved in Canada. Fugitive slave advertisements are what Shane White and Graham White have referred to as, quote, the most detailed descriptions of the bodies of enslaved African Americans available, end quote. I would argue that their contention also applies to most regions of the Americas in general, particularly places where abolition predated the development of photography. So the places where this would not hold up are places like Cuba, the United States, and Brazil, because they abolished slavery so late that you actually have photography of enslaved people. But most regions, you would never have a photograph of an enslaved person. Displaced from their homelands and forced to take up the role of unfree labor in the Americas, The enslavement of Africans severely impeded their ability to remember their histories and to practice their cultures. This was strategic on the part of the white colonialists and slave-owning classes, and evident in the immediate implementation of slaving practices like branding and renaming that were meant to break the enslaved of their sense of individuality, family, and ancestry. Furthermore, ruling class whites deliberately developed the colonial archive to allow Africans to enter as partial and incomplete entries, the objects or stocks owned by another. And a perfect example of this is when you look to regions that had tropical practices of plantation slavery, like Jamaica, for instance. This is an annual slave ledger from Hope Plantation in Jamaica, 18th century. The enslaved people never have a last name, because your last name was the name of the person who owned you. So all you get from these ledgers is often an age or an age range, a type of labor, and a first name. Okay, so that's what I mean by entered into the archive as a partial object, an incomplete entry. This disturbing fact that the most detailed representations of the enslaved were produced by their owners provokes a confrontation with the archive, not as objective or neutral container of facts and information, but as a site through which the elite secured their power through determinations on who could be represented and in what fashion. The colonial archives of European empires were defined by the effacement or the strategic partial representation of the enslaved African. As such, Anne Laura Stoller has explained, we are left to sort out, quote, what was unwritten because it could go without saying, and everyone knew it. What was unwritten because it could not yet be articulated, and what was unwritten because it could not be said, end quote. The callousness of slavery, wherein whites sought to demarcate and preserve their supposed racial difference and superiority, was also enshrined through the sale advertisements in what Aimé Césaire called a process of thingification. This strategic racial hierarchy was the same in Canada as it was in more southern tropical colonies. To my point, the 23rd of March 1773 ad to be sold by public auction in the Nova Scotia Gazette and Weekly Chronicle listed amongst the items to be auctioned at the late Joseph Pierpoint's wharf, a Negro man. Okay, and you'll find him 4 lines from the bottom of the ad. Sandwiched between local and international wares, materials, and animals, the black man's dehumanization was advanced by his listing as merely one of a variety of goods for sale. Following Stoller's insights, I would add to her list what was unwritten because to do so would further humanize the enslaved. As such, I want to suggest that the representation of the enslaved by white slave owners and their surrogates was intended as a strategy of erasure. To this end, the colonial archive, of which fugitive slave ads were a significant part, was an attempt at the mastery of an ever-changing world and the conflation of Africans with the status of slave. While fugitive slave advertisements noted forms of bodily manipulation, like scarification, that were the choice of the enslaved and their communities, they also registered the transformation inflicted by white owners and their surrogates through acts of violence like branding and whipping. The dangers of slave labor in Jamaica where cultivation of sugar were the norm were many. Commonly shoeless, the enslaved often worked with machetes to cut the tough stalks of the full-grown cane, and processing the plant into sugar, rum, and molasses meant dangerous mill and distillery work, the latter in extreme heat. The workers who were tasked with, quote-unquote, feeding the mill at crop time faced the ever-present threat of a loss of fingers or limbs. Even two visiting white women in 19th century Jamaica, Eliza Chadwick Roberts and Maria Nugent, recounted being schooled on the frequency and necessity of the amputation of hands and limbs performed by overseers with hatchets when the enslaved got their fingers drawn into working mills. The disfigurement of the enslaved was a common outcome of their work regimes, and the ferocity of the planters and the surrogates, the overseers and drivers who induced the enslaved to labor beyond natural human limits, produced the extreme fatigue which led to disabling accidents. For the field laborer, work was always incentivized by force with a whip or other implements of torture. The vengeance of the disciplinary regime was not reserved for enslaved males nor for adults. Indeed, the enslaved black men, who the English planter Matthew Lewis referred to as governors or chief governors, otherwise known as drivers, were described by some, like the observer of Jamaican slavery, the Reverend Henry Bickle, as ignorant and revengeful slaves. And in this image here, you can see the driver is the one standing, pointing at the man who's kneeling, and he has the whip in his hand. Okay, so that's a system which elevated strategically certain enslaved people to be capable of physical and corporal violence against other enslaved people, right? So it's a system of divide and conquer then, and strategically so. That the whips that were commonly used on horses, mules, and cattle were normatively also applied to enslaved Africans in Jamaica allows for an understanding of the extent to which not only scars, but nerve damage on various parts of the body, particularly the back and buttocks, would have been common causes of ongoing suffering and shame. As Marcus Wood has argued of Fugitive Notices, quote, "The scars and deformities listed recreated the slave's body as a living and moving text. The advertisements constituted a perpetual catalog of the abuse of the slave body, and as such had the potential to be subverted by anti-slavery authors," end quote. Although it is unclear if branding was a uniform slave practice in parts of Nova Scotia or Quebec, certainly some enslaved people in those sites would have had brand marks, if not from their time in Canada, then from their previous residences. However, runaway slave ads from Nova Scotia do reveal signs of abuse in their description of the bodies of the enslaved. An ad placed by John Rock on Tuesday, September 1st, 1772, recounted the flight of a black female known as Thursday. While the demeaning and comical name paralleled the practice of naming the enslaved after the day of birth in other regions, Thursday's description as a girl is also alarming. While the ad describes her as a Negro girl, about 4.5 feet high, broad set, upon John Rock's death, Thursday was also listed in his estate inventory as a black girl when she was sold to John Bishop for 20 pounds. Okay, so that's line 3 and 4, you'll see that. The duplication of this description, along with the fact that the drive to infantilize the enslaved was more commonly directed at males, would seem to indicate that Thursday truly was, by 18th century standards, a child and had not reached the age of 16. While Rock did not mention if Thursday was branded, he did describe her body in a way that signaled the possibility of corporal punishment. The notice describes Thursday as having, quote, "a lump above her right eye." While the lump may have been caused by an accident, an illness, or even a birth defect, which had nothing to do with Rock, there also exists a very distinct possibility that the lump was a mark of violence inflicted by Rock as a punishment of some kind. If so, the fact that the lump was still visible and the protuberance had not yet healed sufficiently to deprive Rock of this further means of describing Thursday's body may indicate that a physical assault against Thursday had immediately precipitated her flight. The impact of the isolation of enslaved Africans in temperate colonies, where owners tended to possess far fewer enslaved people, must not be underestimated. While the sexual violation of enslaved women in tropical colonies was ubiquitous, similar acts of sexual coercion and terror were surely employed in temperate colonies with impunity, since the lack of a significant slave community within the same residence or on the same property meant that white male sexual predators would have been faced with little to no immediate resistance from other enslaved people, like slave husbands, and therefore likely felt less constrained in their actions. This would have been particularly true in cases where the male slave owner was unmarried. Similarly, the isolation and living arrangements of enslaved people in places like Nova Scotia and Quebec left them open to various forms of corporal punishment and torture. Many fugitive slave notices hint at the effects of such physical abuse. Reuben Tucker's advertisement for the 28-year-old Negro man named Francis Zeb disclosed that Zeb had lost all the toes off one of his feet and walks somewhat lame. Similarly, Andrew Reynolds' fugitive notice of the 7th of September, 1790, described a Negro boy slave named Dick as having lost the first joint of his great toe of the left foot. While Zeb's and Dick's missing toes could have been caused by frostbite or labor accidents, another equally plausible explanation was corporal punishment. When a slave owner named Richardson offered 4 guineas for the return of 2 black men, he described the older, Bon Porter, as about 30 years old, stout and well-made, nearly 5 feet 6 inches high, but also as lame in one foot and limps much in his walk. While Porter's limp may have been the result of a birth defect again or an accident, it could just as easily have been the outcome again of corporal punishment. Quebec fugitive notices also yield physical evidence of hardship and abuse. While the 23-year-old Andrew of Maryland was described by his owner, James Crofton, as having crooked fingers, 25-year-old Fortune was noted as having lost the toes off his right foot, and 20-year-old Charles as having a white mark on the right side of his forehead. Described by Elizabeth McNeil as a Negro man, Cuff also had some scars on his temples and a scar on one of his hands. The printer William Brown's enslaved pressman named Joe had several scars on his legs. John Sargent's enslaved mulatto fellow named Pascal Puro had scars under one of his ears. Azariah Pritchard Sr.'s enslaved Negro man Isaac had lost some of his 4 teeth and has the ends of his great toes frozen off, and a mulatto named Thomas Etherington, who broke out of jail with 3 white male accomplices, was described as walking somewhat lame. In Quebec, it was perhaps Ishmael who possessed the most evidence of abuse and physical hardship. The 36-year-old Negro man was described as wants some of his 4 teeth, or upper 4 teeth, as likewise the first joint of the 4th finger of his left hand. And besides, on the middle of his right leg, he has a fresh scar from a horse kick lately received and cured. The enslaved also bore marks of untreated illnesses. In one such case, an unnamed Negro man was described as having a small scar on the left side of his neck joining the jawbone, occasioned by a gland not yet cured. While the enslaved succumbed to various illnesses, one which plagued people across race and class was the smallpox. As my discussion of the inscription of the bodies of the enslaved with signs of violence and neglect demonstrates, whites used physical traces of black suffering for their own ends. This included the strategic reporting of traces of diseases like smallpox. Both fugitive slave and slave sale ads printed in both Nova Scotia and Quebec routinely mentioned the disease. It was cited for 2 primary reasons. In the former, the scarring which the illness inflicted was documented as a means of identifying the runaway. And in the latter notices, the sale ads, declaring that an enslaved person had survived smallpox was a way to indicate their immunity and healthiness. Robin Wink's research on enslaved people of Indigenous and African descent in Canada indicated that Africans possessed greater resistance to this European disease. He documented the deaths of 58 Indigenous people and only 2 Black people in an epidemic of 1733, and 56 Indigenous people and only 6 Black people in an epidemic of 1755. Illness for the enslaved was not merely a problem of living amongst whites in the Americas, rather it often confronted them prior to embarkation in Africa. As Sawande Mustakim has noted, before his ship, the Duke of Argyll, could depart from West Africa, the Liverpool-based Captain John Newton was forced to dispatch seamen to shore with sickly enslaved people. So he'd already loaded the ship with the enslaved people, and then he sent 2 crew members back to shore with sickly people. This decision was arguably taken more with the aim of removing the diseased person from the ship to stem the spread of infection than to save the lives of the enslaved people. As Marcus Rydecker has explained, once doctors became a standard part of the British slave ship crew with the passage of the Dolben Act, or Slave Carrying Bill, in 1788, it became a central aspect of their job to inspect the newly enslaved on shore for signs of sickness and debility, since a state of good health increased the survival rate during the transatlantic voyage. Neither the unnamed boy nor the girl, noted only as number 92 in the slave ship ledger, destined for Newton's ship, survived the outbreak of the flux. In this case, flux lightly referred to dysentery, sometimes containing blood. It was not surprising that the captain ordered that the unnamed enslaved people be removed from the ship. For the enslaved people in Nova Scotia and Quebec, smallpox appears to have been the illness to which they most often succumbed. As Donald R. Hopkins has noted, over 3 millennia, smallpox probably killed even more people than the plague. In the 18th and into the 19th century, smallpox was a deadly disease that killed indiscriminately and left its survivors sometimes blind and commonly horribly scarred or poxmarked. Known also by the medical name variola, from various spotted or vari pimples, as Douglasson explained, the contagious illness was characterized first by a fever, quote, with pustules appearing from the 3rd to the 5th day and suppurating from the 8th to the 10th, end quote. The spread of the global scourge to Africa and the Americas went hand in hand with Western imperialism. As S.L. Cotter and J.E. Gessler explain, quote, religious travelers to and from Mecca, crusaders, slave traders, merchants, and explorers all played a role in importing it, throughout Africa, the Middle East, India, and finally to Europe and the New World, end quote. Of the 94 Quebec advertisements recorded by Frank Mackey concerning the sale of Black slaves and the flight of Black prisoners, ship deserters, servants, and slaves, smallpox is commonly mentioned by slave owners seeking to recapture or to sell enslaved people, and by employers and ship captains seeking fugitive indentured servants and deserting sailors. Indeed, the scars left by smallpox were so ubiquitous and widely acknowledged that slave owners noted when enslaved fugitives did not bear the marks. Such was the case when an owner, anonymous, commented in a 1769 Quebec Gazette fugitive ad that a Negro woman named Susanna was smooth-faced. As Trevor Bernard has argued, for the enslaved in Jamaica, the enslaved in Nova Scotia and Quebec also lived in a world of radical uncertainty. We must therefore contemplate the too easily overlooked or underestimated scars, emotional and psychological, which were not necessarily visible to observers. For instance, the stammer of the Negro man named Bruce which was documented in a Fugitive ad of 1766 in the Quebec Gazette, may not have been a so-called normal speech impediment, but rather a manifestation of a nervous disorder. Bruce's psychological suffering may have been exasperated by what appears to have been his rental to a Montreal merchant named John Grant by his owner, the Lieutenant Colonel Gabriel Christie. Fugitive slave ads not only documented how the enslaved dressed, but how their bodies appeared. As such, owners took great pains to describe the runaways' mannerisms, expressions, and physical habits, things over which they had once exerted extreme, even sadistic control. As Charles Joyner has demonstrated, quote, slaveholders' intervention in the bodily appearance of their slaves could even extend to expectations about gesture, movement, and general demeanor. How slaves reacted when spoken to, how they walked, where they directed their gaze, whether they appeared content. Though he liked being kind to his people, Robert F.W. Alston, a South Carolinian with a great many slaves, declared that he imperatively required of them cheerfulness in their work, wherever and whatever it is, end quote. That whites sought to control not just the labor of the enslaved, but their attitudes towards that labor is evidence of the extreme surveillance and control under which they lived. Returning to the naming of scars, branding, and whip marks brings up yet another issue. The grueling and barbaric nature of slavery and the ubiquity of corporal punishment and arduous and dangerous labor practices meant that the bodies of the enslaved were transformed over time. Newly arrived Africans in the Americas would have undergone a radical physical transformation that began with the material deprivation central to the harrowing shipboard experience of the Middle Passage. The lack of a proper and differentiated diet, mainly one which included more than carbohydrates, meant that enslaved Africans routinely arrived in the Americas both infirm and malnourished, afflictions that were necessarily evident in their bodies, hence the practice of washing and oiling the enslaved prior to auction in various locations of the Americas to make them look healthier than they were. While there exists irrefutable evidence that the bodies of the enslaved in Jamaica were commonly marked by violence, Canadian fugitive slave notices also documented scars, amputations, and illnesses, which were the product of dangerous work regimes and corporal punishment. Furthermore, the isolating nature of slave life in slave minority contexts like Nova Scotia and Quebec, where one or a small number of enslaved people lived in the same residence or on the same property as the owners, provided an abundance of privacy in which to enact various forms of abuse, punishment, and torture away from prying eyes. While far more research is needed to determine if specific practices like branding and scarification were respectively employed or prohibited in Nova Scotia and Quebec, in conjunction with other primary sources like slave owner journals, correspondence, and estate inventories, the Canadian Fugitive Slave Archive will allow us to understand the nature of the punishment and abuse from which enslaved Africans were routinely fleeing. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Do we have a? Do we
now
need
we're
this?
See if this microphone works.
Okay.
I'm not sure it does.
No.
No.
Okay.
Do we have the first one still? No.
Do we have the first mic?
Microphone. Yeah.
I have two because one is
of
one's
course.
Recording and one is
projecting.
Yeah.
Of course.
Maybe they can just project and I can. Yeah. Should we do that way?
Yeah, let's hope so.
Okay.
Can everyone hear me? Because we can't get the microphone here working. So I'd just like to first of all thank Charmaine Nelson for this amazing lecture. This annual James McCune Smith lecture is, of course, as Rosie pointed out, particularly poignant and meaningful this year as we laid the foundation stone for the James McCune Smith building recently here at the University of Glasgow. As part of the University of Glasgow's, well, as a first step in the University of Glasgow's attempt to wrestle with and engage with and confront the ongoing legacies of slavery and the slave trade at this university. And I know that's something that also McGill University is grappling with at the moment. Their founder, James McGill, having been educated at the University of Glasgow, all these entanglements run very deep. Yes. And this presentation piece is really an incredible introduction to a world of slavery and enslavement that I think is very understudied and little understood. And I particularly liked in your conclusion that you brought out this aspect of the emotional, the register of this attempt at emotional control. I think it's something that also comes out still in contemporary racism, this projection of emotions onto people, this assumption that you can know the inner emotional state. As I noticed in a couple of the adverts you put up, they would describe the man as sullen or downcast, and this assumption that you know
their inner world.
The emotions that play. And I also always thought, well, what a terrible mistake they're making, because these people might not be quite so sullen and downcast once they've fled from your control. So
Exactly.
But I would really like to invite some questions from the audience on this topic. Do we have anyone?
It's just a bit of a basic question. I may have missed it, you may have answered it in your lecture, but there was a lot of missing toes and things like that. Do you think that would be because, maybe punishment from previous escape attempts or discouraging escape? I'm not sure if you said that, I missed it.
Oh, no problem, right. So there's a lot of, you'll see in the ads, a lot of missing digits. Toes and fingers. So I think that's why, so for all the scholars here and the students who study transatlantic slavery, we're always working with a deficit of information. So we will never, for most enslaved people, know the full story. For most of these people, I can't tell you what happened to them after they ran away. Thursday is so rare because we actually, so extremely rare because what happened, the slave owner dies before she does, so that he passes her down in the estate, so we know she changes hands. But in most cases, you just don't know. So that's why I would say, for instance, that even with Thursday and the bruise on her face, I strongly suspect that John Rock hit her in the face, but I can't prove it, right? So I have to say it could be an illness, it could be some other, she could have fallen down when she was working in the field or something, right? So in the same way, missing digits could be from things like labor accidents, because the thing too that I didn't get to mention was a lot of these enslaved people in Canada, what makes it different too in a lot of ways from practices like Jamaica, is that they weren't specialized in terms of the types of labor they were meant to do. So it would be go make me some butter, milk the cow, and then also pick the apples. You'd have to do everything, because if you're it for that family, you're it for that family. So the types of labor then for men and women, you'd be moving between domestic labor and so-called outdoor or country labor. So some of it could have been labor accidents, but also because it's Canada, some of the ads actually mention frostbite and say this person's toes are missing from frostbite. So the other thing there that's interesting in American North Canada, places like Argentina, is if you didn't clothe your enslaved person properly, your property is going to get damaged. So there's an imperative for you as an owner to actually give them proper clothing, but of course there's failures within that. So we understand that some of the footwear, and clothing was just not up to scratch, and so you do see damage to feet, especially from frostbite. So I think in that case it's hard to say, but definitely it could be weather related, or it could be also accident related or corporal punishment related, right? Yeah.
Just on that thought, they also could have literally taken their shoes as a punishment, because they could then damage their feet, as in they get cold, and in theory, for a short amount of time, a punishment could have been, okay, I'm going to take your clothing away from you, it's cold and horrible, deal with that.
No, that's a very good point. So to remove shoes or to remove other items that are personal or beloved of the enslaved person as form as punishment. You'll notice when I showed you the two ads for Bell, When she runs away in August, she's running away with no shoes and stockings, which even though it's August and it's hot in Canada, that's extremely rare for a Canadian notice to have an enslaved person fleeing without footwear. So for me too, what that adds signals for Belle is there's something going on in that household where she fled without a plan. When you compare her to Chloe or compare her to Cash, Cash obviously probably planned because she took a whole lot of clothes with her, right? And then she fled also with with a boy named Nemo. And Chloe, of course, had to put the ladder and all these things. So there was a plan in place. But for Belle fleeing with no shoes and stockings, she just went in that moment, you know? And that is not the case if you see the shoelessness in a place like Jamaica is just normal. So that's a way, too, we always have to really know the context and think about that. But you're right. Like removing someone or hiding someone's shoes, especially if it's March or February, where are you going to go? Right, so the first thing you'd have to do then is find your shoes or steal some shoes before you could even attempt to flee. So the other thing connected to that too, if I can just throw in, as you can imagine, the bulk of the ads I showed you are in the spring and the summer. Because to try to escape in the winter or the fall was extremely perilous because you might freeze to death, literally, if you don't have a plan and you don't know a specific person is going to harbor you and take you inside. So when you see too as well, there's ways to read a level of desperation or perhaps a more sophisticated reasoning when you see someone escaping in the winter. We really have to think about what was going on that led to that March escape, for instance, yeah.
Lincoln Greco first. Thank you. Is there any evidence or any reports on whether physical abuse was a taboo or was it a blatant thing on the part of the slave owners?
Well, in Canada, I think we could argue that it was standard. So here's the thing. I really believe that John Rock hit Thursday in the face, okay? And part of how I've come to that is that there's also a fugitive notice for a white indentured servant who runs away from Rock the year before. So something is going on in Rock's household where even a white free person doesn't want to stay with him. Okay, so I can't deduce, I haven't been able to deduce yet if Thursday and the man's name was James Twyfoot were actually in the house together. But if so, one question would be, why didn't they team up and flee together? So perhaps they weren't there at the same time. Perhaps James ran away and then he bought Thursday. So I still need to work on that. But John Rock then is an example then of an abusive slave owner who is not afraid to actually print that he hit someone in the face. Because he doesn't have to give that detail. He could have just said she's 5'4" and her name is Thursday and this is what she's wearing. But he is operating in a world with impunity where he's perfectly free to say that this woman has a bruise on her face because she's considered chattel. And chattel, like to get really strict there, so the legal definition is movable personal property. So enslaved people across the Americas and then when they would come to Europe were no different from this desk or that chair in the law. So why wouldn't you say that they have a bruise on their face, right? So, and another way I can back that up too, that there's court cases I've come across in Nova Scotia specifically where enslaved people were murdered and they're being tried not for the person's murder, but for the loss of property. Okay, and you'll find that across the Americas as well. So that abuse, the same type of culture of abuse against your object is prevalent in Canada as well. It just shows up in different ways. And then the archives we're working with are different, of course, because the slave ledger I showed you, like for Hope Plantation, you wouldn't find that kind of document in Canada because you don't have people who own 300 enslaved people. So it's like the evidence shifts, but what you find from the evidence is actually quite similar in terms of these types of issues.
When a slave ran away, what did they have an expectation that they would somehow become free? Or was it to find a better master, or simply just desperate to get away from a terrorism?
Right. I think, okay, so what happens and what's the motivation? So that's a great question. So I think that they're all three, right? So sometimes the ads, or perhaps the ones I showed you didn't show this, but sometimes the ads will actually say things like, my enslaved Negro man, Belfast, who's from South Carolina. Now, why would you say that? Why do you care to say where he's from? One might be because he has an accent, which would be a tell if you ever talk to him. Another reason might be because he might be headed back to South Carolina. because you removed him from South Carolina to Nova Scotia, and he still has family in South Carolina. So in many cases, we believe that enslaved people are trying to go back to their family and their loved ones. Another reason, of course, just to get out of the bonds of slavery altogether, so to escape the colony altogether. So one thing that you see in the ads that I showed you here too, do you notice how many times it said, basically, I will sue you, I will prosecute you if you harbor, conceal, right? And they warned ship captains specifically. Why? Because in the British Empire, there was actually quite a significant percentage of free black sailors who were, you know, on British ships. So if you're an enslaved man, one strategy would be, let me get onto a ship, beg the captain, who always has desertions. The ship docks, people run. The crew runs away. So the captain's always dealing with a deficit of sailors. So let me beg him, pass me off as a free black sailor and get me out of here altogether. And there's a really interesting case of an enslaved man named Joe, who I mentioned as having scars on his legs. And Joe was incredible. Joe is, to my knowledge, the most resistant enslaved person ever in the history of Canada anywhere. We have 6 runaway ads for Joe. And Joe was an African-born person, so it's really extraordinary already, because the majority of people enslaved in Canada were so-called Creole, meaning they were born in the Americas. So they were African-Canadian, African-American, African-Caribbean, Indigenous in Quebec, so also people, the colonial term Indian, were actually enslaved in Quebec as well. And then the smallest percentage of that slave minority population was African. So people actually who had survived the Middle Passage, right? So Joe had a memory of his freedom, okay? So Joe somehow ends up in Quebec City, enslaved by the printer of the Quebec Gazette, the owner of the newspaper. So that owner then trains him, and this is extraordinary too. He forces Joe to become fluent in French and English because he wants him to work on the press. This is, you don't understand how crazy this is. Because across the Americas, enslaved people were, under threat of corporal punishment, not allowed to learn to read and write, because you don't want an enslaved person to be able to see in the newspaper, oh, there's a revolution in Haiti. I got me some ideas now, right? That's the last thing you want. So across the Americas, reading, writing for enslaved people, bad. But Joe is forced to become fluent in French and English because he ends up, by the last ad, he is the pressman. He's running the press of the Quebec Gazette, so he knew exactly what William Brown would do to hunt him. Okay, but there's 6 ads for Joe. And the last one, there's 2. One from the sheriff and one from William Brown for the same escape, 1786. But the sheriff is putting the ad because Joe runs away, he gets caught, he gets thrown in jail, because you notice a lot of the ads say put them in a jail and I'll come and get them, right? And then he busts out of jail with a white criminal named John Peters. Okay? But interesting there too, 3 of Joe's and 5 known escapes are the winter. So Joe is just off the charts, extraordinary, resistant. But we know that Joe too tried to leave the colony altogether because Joe was caught on a ship. So he made it onto the ship, and then William Brown paid a bailiff to take him off the ship, had him publicly whipped, and then in one of the later ads, you see that William Brown's saying Joe has scars on his legs. The earlier ads, he's not mentioning he has scars on his legs, right? So there's ways you can start to piece this together, but you can see how difficult it is because there's gaps in the archive, right? And we're relying to a large extent, as I said, on the fugitive archive itself, which is then descriptions from the slave owners, which are very limited in certain strategic ways, right?
One more question for you. Thank you very much. It's a really wonderful presentation. I just want to build on some of the earlier questions about the semiotics of shoelessness.
Right.
So I work on poverty in the early modern world, and every time I give a presentation recently, I've been asked the question, how does the category of poverty in my field of analysis relate to the category of slavery? And now in the position to ask somebody who works on slavery, how this kind of category of poverty might come in. I'm just wondering, whether in any of your documents you ever see the conditions of slaves being described as poor, or any kind of references to poverty. And I guess that's just not only a kind of selfish question, but also perhaps relates to kind of broader moral economy around would the description of a slave as poor be sort of seen as shameful to the owner, that has a kind of obligation to kind of keep the slave in a certain condition as well. And also the thing that I'm coming to in my own work about this is kind of that there's something kind of about dehumanization in the category of poverty, and I just wanted to ask whether what you think about this.
Thank you for that question. Wow. Okay. So certain things just came to mind. Okay. So Canada, to my knowledge, the different parts that I mentioned, they never introduced sumptuary laws. So there were never laws against what people could wear, never laws against how you could dress your enslaved person. Whereas in parts of specifically places like the Spanish Americas, you'll have sumptuary laws in certain places, right? Interestingly, let me just compare for instance. So 18th century, 19th century Lima and Mexico City, we know that slave owners used their enslaved people as extensions of their own body. So in those places actually where sumptuary laws were introduced, enslaved people were dressed very elegantly, like pearls, diamonds, gold, jewelry, because, for instance, if a lady, a rich female slave owner went out, her entourage of enslaved women were seen as an extension of her own body. So them looking beautiful was her looking beautiful. Not so in Canada. So what you find in a lot of the ads, and the ads I showed you here too, you notice you find clothing with nondescript colors. Like they can't even say what color it is because it's so old and worn and torn and bedaubed with paint. So what we have in Canada in terms of clothing as signs of impoverishment is that we have a secondhand clothing of the enslaved. So there's no precise slave dress in terms of like clothing that would put on, not footwear, but in terms of shirts, dresses, etc. I believe what was happening was slave owners were giving their slaves their secondhand clothing. So therefore then you have the exact same clothes that a rich European might be wearing, but the only difference is that it's old and worn because it's secondhand. So there's one ad, for instance, an enslaved man, mulatto, named Tom Brooks is wearing a white beaver hat. And you're like, how does he have a white beaver hat? Because it's an old white beaver hat. Okay, so the way then that their bodies would signal poverty would be in the oldness, the disrepair, and the discoloration of those garments, I believe. Was there another part to that question too? And shoelessness, again, is not going to come up in Canada unless, again, it's some kind of weird punishment that's at your own peril as a slave owner, because you're finding, actually, shoes are interesting because you're finding there a creolization that's occurring in the transformation of enslaved dress and just dress in those colonies in general between European, African, and indigenous garments. So a lot of the enslaved are wearing moccasins, and they're wearing blanket coats, which are indigenous clothing. So that would be really different in Canada and, let's say, the American North compared to places, let's say, in the Caribbean. You wouldn't necessarily find that in places like Jamaica, where the Arawak population is almost totally, wiped out by the time that the British people get there, right? So that would be a very different thing that you'd find, yeah. But I think then you could say then that the enslaved body in a space like Quebec or Nova Scotia is signaling a level of impoverishment and the strategic then social material disenfranchisement that you see in other places. Yeah.
Okay, we have two final questions or more. So,
here. So a lot of these people's names were changed.
Yes.
In your research, have you come across, because a lot of the names, they're English names. In your research, have you come across people who, after fleeing or after being set free, who have African names?
That's such a great question. So I haven't come across that yet. It's something I'm trying to see if I can come across. And part of the issue for us as a scholar is, what is the next archive I look at? So for instance, if I want to figure out if Joe ever got permanent freedom, where do I look beside the ad? Because the ad only has a limit, right? So what I do with the ad is I'll look if there's multiple printings of the ad, because these colonial newspapers were printed weekly, not daily. So I could deduce for how long perhaps someone stayed on the run, but then that's always tricky too. Why? Because at what point does a slave owner just give up and say, I'm spending too much money on this ad, and it's not an indication the person was caught, right? So there's always multiple archives you have to check, like for instance a jail record, if it still exists. Now, back to your point of the naming. So there are definitely ads in Canada that show that enslaved people were resisting through maintaining a different name than the one the owner had imposed. But the ads that I've come across, like I believe I showed you one where the man was named Isaac, but he goes by Charles. So the owner has to concede that, see? So this is what I'm saying, right? The owners, because they want their quote-unquote property back, they're going to even write down, they're going to print the ways that this person is resisting them, right? And there's another ad, too, of an enslaved man, the one from South Carolina, who called himself Bill, but the owner called him Belfast. But he has to say in the ad, he calls himself Bill. So I've seen ads like that where the owner is conceding that the enslaved person has another, what we call European name, but none yet in Canada where they're preserving an African name, which would be pretty standard again, because people like Joe, who of course his real name was not Joe, because he was born in Africa, he's a minority within the minority. So there's so few African-born people in Canada that they're not hanging on to African names, right? Because they're Creole people. But I think I've come across that definitely in American fugitive ads, places where the ships dock directly from Africa, where you have ads saying, this person, I call them Billy, but he goes by the name, and they'll give an African name. So when you actually look to places where the slave ships came right from Africa, you'll find more ads showing resistance through the retention of an African name.
Okay, thank you.
So a question here,
Finding evidence.
Sorry, I was reading first of it. Oh, sorry, I'm sure. Sorry. Yes.
Have you found any evidence of the Mi'kmaq keeping slaves in Scotia?
Oh, the Mi'kmaq. So the Mi'kmaq from primarily, I think, in Nova Scotia today, what today is Nova Scotia, is an indigenous group of people. I haven't found indication that they were, well, okay. There are different indigenous groups participating in indigenous slavery, which is not chattel slavery. So this is a thing that we need to distinguish. Indigenous slavery was not about race or differences on a, perceived differences on a biological level that meant that one indigenous group thought the other indigenous group was actually subhuman, right? Chattel slavery is that. So to make it really complicated in Canada, thank you for this question. In Quebec, you had first the French, of course, who colonized what is today Quebec, and they called it New France. And they started slaving through permission of King Louis XIV, and they said to him, listen, we don't have enough laborers, will you let us put Africans on the ships that are already coming from the French Caribbean up to Montreal and Quebec City? And he said, are they gonna die because it's too cold? And they said, I'm paraphrasing, right? And they said, basically, no, slavery's working in the Northeast, like look at New England, look at New York State, it's working. So he gave his permission, so this began around the 1680s. Then, the slavery they constituted then was to continue enslaving indigenous people, and then to also bring in people of African descent primarily from the French Caribbean, like Haiti, Martinique, Guadeloupe. So those two systems got fused within the French Empire in terms of that section of New France, which is today Quebec. Then the British come in 1760, they conquer the French, they take over. The British, everywhere else in what became Canada, were only enslaving people of African descent. But in this case, they go, oh, we leave your system alone. So in the Treaty of Capitulation is written in that all the slave owners were allowed to keep their enslaved people, and then the British come in and they start actually doing that dual system of enslavement too. So that's the only province where you'll find enslaved people of indigenous and African descent would be Quebec. And then the other places further east in Ontario, they're enslaving primarily within chattel, transatlantic slavery, people of African descent. And then the systems, though, at the same time of indigenous slavery are also functioning in the country. So it's very, very complex. But basically what I'm talking about is transatlantic slavery or chattel slavery. Right?
First of all, just to say thank you so much. And, if it's the first time you've been to Scotland, then well done. Everything you've done for us today is really well. Dr. Nelson, my question actually about your work is there any records within the damage done to the bodies of slaves being reflected into their valuation by their owners as property? And is there in Canada documentation the way we have in Scotland, as we try very hard to forget our legacy, that actually we are very litigious lot in Scotland? So part of the fact is that the records we have are to do with the insurance claims, the legal cases and the losses. And that is where we find out a lot of evidence about people in Scotland who were enslaved. Is there anything similar in Canada? That's question one. And question two was about the narrative amnesia, historical forgetting. Does Canada have, I suppose it must do, the same issue with remembering itself as abolitionists and not remembering that they were enslaved?
Don't get me started on that one. Those are great questions. Thank you so much. Okay, so the first one, damage and valuation. Okay, so I'm sure there would be insurance records. I don't know of any scholar yet of Canadian slavery, and myself also hasn't looked at them yet. So part of the problem with studying Canadian slavery is, seriously, like, I know everybody else who studies Canadian slavery. I can name them on my two hands, okay? And like people who, like, this is our major specialization, right? And remember, Canada we're a massive nation with a small population, right? Huge nation, 36 million people, but we have a lot of universities. And to think that really there's like probably 10 of us who specialize in Canadian slavery, it's ridiculous. So it's not supported by the infrastructure of the government. They're not interested in what we do. And there's no, like in the USA, there's African American studies departments, right? They're in the hundreds, actually, and there's now 7 places you can get a PhD in African American studies. Doesn't exist in Canada, even though we have this parallel history. So that's the place where you probably house a lot of people who have these interests. So the insurance records, I'm sure they're there. For instance, if I go back to example of Joe, before he got to Quebec City, when he's taken from Africa, we know he ended up in New York State or Philadelphia, because William Brown, there's a record from a letter from 1768 where he's writing to his previous employer in Philadelphia where he used to live saying, please send me a Negro boy because I've been working with all these French Canadians on my press and they're insolent, and the second I train them, they go off for better wages. So basically, I need someone who cannot leave me, right? So he says, send me a Negro boy, and think of the callousness of that. Because he doesn't say, send me 3 Negro boys who are brothers, or send me a Negro mother and her son. So he knows he's wrenching a little kid away from something. So Joe is the one who gets sent, but he says in the letter too, before you put him on the ship, he's really knowledgeable. He says, I know you can get him to me by the fall because there's ships coming in the summer. So before you put him on the ship, insure him. So insurance wasn't just about the Middle Passage, and you insured the so-called slave cargo from Africa to the Americas. Insurance is about the one-off enslaved person who gets ripped around and thrown around the Americas too, right? So I'm sure there would be those documents. It's just to figure out where they are, because part of the issue too is that a lot of, to your second point, are Canadians resistive to this history? Yes, we are. And do we have amnesia? Yes, we do. So for instance, I've been teaching a course called The Visual Culture of Slavery, because I'm an art historian. You wouldn't know it from this lecture, but I'm actually an art historian. And I've been teaching it for probably a decade now. I usually have anywhere from 70 to 100 students. And usually about, let's say, this year I have 93 students. Let's say about 60 are Canadian, 20 American, the rest from some other country. I have some Brits in there too. So my point being, though, I've never had a Canadian student enter the class knowing that slavery transpired in Canada. So think about this, right? Because when I get them, they're usually between 18 and 23. So they've gone through the whole curriculum in Canada, kindergarten into grade 12, and no clue. So if they bypass my class, which you can imagine is not required, my course is elective, right? They go out into the world and just don't know anything. But what they all come into the class knowing without fail is from about grade 2, they were trained in the Underground Railroad, which is, if you don't know this, it's a 30-year window where between the British abolition of the slave trade, or slavery, sorry, in 1833, and the American Civil War in 1865. So in that window when, as Canadians, or we weren't yet Canada, British North America, we had to abolish slavery because Britain said so. Parliament in London said you have to stop, everywhere stops in the British Empire. So in that 3-decade window then, enslaved African Americans were fleeing north across the border to freedom into Canada. That's what all my Canadian students are trained in. So they come in going, oh my gosh, we're the wonderful abolitionists, what are you saying to me, what are you showing me in this class, I'm totally distraught. And then the Americans, though, their blind spot, because I usually have about 20% Americans, is the American North. They're like, Massachusetts, don't talk to me. Like New York State, Pennsylvania had slavery. It's like, yeah, they did. And they kept building the slave ships after abolition too. So they, even though they were out in terms of ownership, they still fully participated in terms of enterprise and wealth, right? So we have these major blind spots, but Canada is bad. No, seriously, we're probably like worse than Scotland. I'm telling you. No, seriously. No, it's really bad. No, it's really bad. Like I say to the students, if we go outside and we go walk down to Sherbrooke Street, you know, outside McGill University, and we stop 10 Canadians, we'd be lucky to find one who would say, yeah, I knew that slavery happened in Canada. Like it's really, really bad. But they all have that narrative of, what are you talking? We saved everybody. We saved the African American enslaved people. So it's really, really embedded in our curriculum from an early age, that narrative in Canada, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Nelson. And we're going to move on to some of the life and nibbles. It's going to get short now. It was so nice to end on that note of remembering and bringing us back to curriculum. This week we had the Royal Historical Society report, which is on race and ethnic minority history and engagement in Britain. These are really just super important issues right now. So,
this is really just a final word. I'm Faye Hamel and I'm the other co-organiser along with Moses Spooner and Christine White. So first of all, thank you very, very much, Charmaine, for that fantastic lecture and also for the questions and discussion, which was just as good to you. So that's just wonderful. And thank you both for the organisation. But I also have a more financial thank you to make, which I was going to put my logo, but I don't know if I'll manage to find it. I just wanted to very briefly mention how this event came about. It's partly the James McCune Smith lecture, as we mentioned, but it's also related to funding that I've received from the Canada-UK Foundation, because my specialist area is Canadian studies. So they have generously paid for most of the reception. And there is Prosecco, and so please come and drink it afterwards. Then I also wanted to kind of initiate with this event a kind of informal network of people in Glasgow or near Glasgow that are interested in Canada. So if you do have Canadian connections or interests or family or education, I am trying to set up a bit of a network which will help us to organise more events like these and publicise them and get an audience, and also host perhaps possibly in the future things like exhibitions. But most certainly the next thing that's going to happen in relation to this network is we'll be having a visiting Canadian author in May. The Ullapool Book Festival has a Canadian author every year, so we're able to host them on their way up to Ullapool. So if you would like to get more news about Canadian things in Glasgow, I've just put my email address there and you can get in touch. But I principally just wanted to thank Charmaine and Rosie and Christine for everything that you've contributed to this event, and thank you very much for coming.